Hello, everyone, and welcome to EarthX CEO, a weekly series on EarthX TV. Each week, we speak with business presidents and CEOs about their leadership on sustainability and climate change issues. I'm Bob Perciasepe, president of the Center for Climate and Energy Solutions, and with us today is our very first conversation with Brad Smith. Brad, thanks so much for joining. Let me just say a few words about you. As Microsoft's president, you play a key role in spearheading the company's work on critical issues involving the intersection of technology and society. And this includes issues like cybersecurity, privacy, artificial intelligence, immigration, philanthropy, and environmental sustainability. The Australian Financial Review described you as one of the technology's industry's most respected figures, and the New York Times has called you the de facto ambassador for the technology industry at large. So I'm really excited and welcome to this conversation, Brad.
Well, thank you. Thank you for having me. I'm delighted to be the first person to be here and help kick this off.
Wonderful. Well, let's get it started, because obviously we want to talk about Microsoft and its role in society as well. This year, Microsoft has really sort of moved the needle on corporate leadership in the arena of climate change and sustainability with a plan toward going carbon negative by 2030. And then with that going negative, trying to balance out the emissions that the company has had since it started in the 1970s. This is quite a commitment, and on top of that, a commitment to help develop innovation and technology. So why don't you tell us a little bit about that plan and the work that you guys are doing on that?
Yeah, well, thank you. And we kicked off what we called 4 sustainability sprints, the first of which we launched in January, and the fourth we just launched a couple of days ago. And they're really around carbon, around biodiversity, around waste, and around water. And one of the things we recognized is that, frankly, we need to do more work in each of these areas. I do think the work that we're doing around climate or carbon has perhaps captured more of people's attention than the others, and it certainly helped us focus as well. As you said, we said that we'll be carbon negative as a company by the year 2030. What that means is that we'll both be cutting our carbon emissions roughly in half compared to where we are today, and then each and every year we will be removing from the environment more carbon than we emit. And in fact, we said that by the year 2050, we will remove from the environment all the carbon that Microsoft has emitted since it was founded in 1975. We're especially excited, I would say, about this for a few reasons. First, it's a big ambition for us. We spent a lot of time defining the ambition. Second, we recognize that having an ambition is important, but you actually need a plan to make the ambition achievable. And we believe we put together a plan that will do that. Part of what we're trying to do, to be candid, is help change the conversation. We think that we all have a lot more to learn from each other when it comes to thinking about scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions. Scope 1 being what we directly emit, for example, when we drive a car powered by gasoline. Scope 2 being the carbon emissions that are emitted when the electricity is generated that we consume. And scope 3 is really everything else. So the supply chain, you buy concrete for a building. Well, that concrete was created based on carbon emissions. That's part of your scope 3 emissions. If you're a business and you create products like we do, we create Xbox gaming consoles. They run on electricity. When people plug them into the wall and they use our products, that causes carbon to be emitted. And so one of the things we really wanted to do was say we would make this commitment not just for scope 1 and 2, but when it comes to being carbon negative by 2030 for our scope 3 emissions as well. And we think the world needs that level of ambition if we're going to do what needs to be done by the middle of this century.
Yeah, these are, as I said, I think you guys have moved the needle, in terms of your colleagues in other businesses and in the technology industry when they look at what you're trying to do and the plans that you've laid out. They are ambitious and they are focused on leadership. One of the things that I think is pretty important for people to hear, Brad, is what motivates a company to move in this direction. How does that come about inside a company where you have leaders like yourself, you gather up all the brain trust, and you guys sit down and you figure out, well, why do we want to do this? Why not wait to see what happens? What's motivating you?
Well, I think that is a really important question, and for us at Microsoft, it was three things. The first was the science and the data. As we like to say, our work in this area is science-led and data-driven. 5 years ago, when I was named the president of the company, one of the things that I assumed responsibility for was our sustainability work. And we had a small but very good team at that point. And it gave us a grounding, including in the part of Microsoft that does basic research, Microsoft Research, in environmental science. And so over time, what we decided to do was create a team that would bring together environmental scientists, computer scientists, and data scientists. And that, I think, grounded us, frankly, in the facts, what we're going to need to do as a planet to ensure that humanity can continue to prosper here. The second thing we did was listen to our employees, and our employees have been vocal. When you're in the tech sector, the truth is you're only as good as your next product, and your next product's only going to be as good as the employees that you hire and retain and develop. And a lot of our employees are younger. And for them, this issue around climate and carbon is extremely important, not just in terms of what they want to see governments do, but what they want to hear and see their employer do. So I would meet with employee groups, and it was a question I would get frequently, and often I would be a question that was followed by, can't you do more? And then the final thing that really motivated us was feedback from customers. And I would have to say customers in Western Europe over the past year and a half in particular. As I would travel the world with my colleagues, we would meet with customers, and they too, especially in Western Europe, provided a voice that encouraged us to reach higher. So when we put these three things together, frankly, it was one of these things where the data told us what the world needs us to do, and our customers and employees told us what they wanted us to do. And I think serving the world and advancing our business really coalesced. And whenever that happens, it's a pretty powerful thing.
Those are pretty good reasons, and they're certainly interwoven with a business case. Now, not to go into details on your book that you wrote and published last year, Tools and Weapons, which is the good and the bad, or the opportunities and the challenges of technology. But in that discussion, which is a long one and very thorough in the book, you walked up to the issue of where does the government and the businesses work together to deal with these issues. And so we have a similar situation here with sustainability and climate change. A lot of your plan relies on innovation that needs to occur. How do you see the relationship with government policy and a company like yours striving to be more sustainable? I mean, obviously you're in a system. So talk a little bit about how you see the intersection with government policy and your plans.
I think it's a really interesting topic to think about. When you think about climate and carbon or any of these sustainability challenges, let's face it, they are huge issues. And I think it's unrealistic to think that governments can solve these problems by themselves, but it's equally unrealistic to think that we can solve them without strong government policy. But in addition to government policy, we need to put the market and market forces to work. And that means I think there is a real role for businesses. And whenever you need government and business to do something, you usually need great nonprofits, NGOs, civil society to come together as well. So it's this partnership. And that's something that we in our business and in the tech sector have seen for a number of other issues as well. Carol Ann Brown, who I work with every day at Microsoft, and I wrote our book based in very much on sort of the real world experience of interacting with others in the tech sector and with people in government around issues like privacy and security, access to broadband, digital skills. And there was just this common thread that ran through every topic, and I think runs through sustainability as well. In the tech sector and in the business community, I think we need to push ourselves harder. I think we need to step up and we need to act with more ambition and then execute the way I think businesses sometimes almost uniquely are capable of executing in the world today. But we need governments to move faster. We urgently need governments to move faster, including on the sustainability issue. So in each of the 4 areas that we've made a sustainability focus, whether it's water this week or climate in January, we've spelled out not only what we want to do, but opportunities to work more broadly with the business community and where we think government policy needs to evolve and can make a difference as well.
So even before you put out your plans this year, going back to January, Microsoft had an internal price on carbon, an internal accounting system to look at how the impacts of different development projects were going. Has that helped you as you went forward with your own policies and plans that you worked on this year?
I think we have benefited enormously from having an internal carbon tax at Microsoft. I mean, this is not something that I was an expert in 5 years ago, and I've just come away so persuaded by its importance. At Microsoft, our internal carbon tax is not a shadow price. Some companies will have a shadow price so people know what they would pay if they were being taxed. Ours is a real tax, which means every part of the company has to pay into the corporate center a fee. And the fee is based on dollars per metric ton and the metric tons that they are responsible for emitting. So we started with a lower price tax back in 2012, and this was only applicable to scope 1 and 2 emissions. So it didn't get at our supply chain or the use of our products. We raised that price to $15 a metric ton a couple of years ago, and then we expanded our internal carbon tax to our scope 3 emissions this year at a lower price, but it's going to go up every year till it gets to $15 as well. And what I have found is that it's really done 3 things. First, it really galvanizes people's attention. They now know if they're a manager or they run a department, they know what they're doing that is emitting carbon. Second, it gives them an incentive to reduce their emissions. Typically when a government has a tax, it's thinking about it as a long-term sustainable source of revenue. Well, the interesting part about this is we have revenue projections and they go up and then they go down over time because we believe that just having to pay this is creating the right incentives for people to reduce their carbon. The third thing it does is it does create a really valuable source of revenue. We use that money in our sustainability work to make ourselves more efficient, to reduce our energy consumption, to become greener, to use more renewable energy. One of the fascinating things I'm just finding in the last few months is we've taken some of the added revenue generated by the expansion of this internal tax to scope 3 emissions, and we've issued an RFP. We've issued an RFP to go purchase around the world services to remove 1 million metric tons of carbon from the environment in this year alone. It's probably the biggest RFP of its kind. And I think when we can do that type of thing, I think we can have an outsized impact in sending signals to the market that will hopefully encourage even more investment in things like carbon removal technology. So from my vantage point, the ability to apply this tax and put it to this kind of use has been an absolute game changer for Microsoft.
So it gives us some hope that that if we use these market mechanisms in society at large, these kinds of motivations can be more ubiquitously distributed in the economy. Obviously, getting the full economy zeroed in on this is really an important role. There's a couple of other points, I think, in your work that you all announced this year that I think are worth a little bit of comment on. You also identified a $1 billion fund that you wanted to use, which I think is different than the revenue adjustments from the internal carbon tax.
That's right.
Do you see that aligning with some of the challenges you still see? They use that fund to try to look at some of the emerging technologies and maybe help motivate some investments by others?
I absolutely do, and that was another part of our January announcement. We created a $1 billion climate innovation fund to specifically invest in, among other things, but with a high priority, new technologies that would advance, say, carbon removal. And one of the things that I think is so interesting to consider is that there is an enormously large and important industry that doesn't yet really exist. Call it the carbon removal industry. It reminds me of being a college student in the 1980s, and I still remember sitting on an airplane flight going from the Northeast back to the Midwest, just happened to be seated next to a person who said, there's this thing that's going to become really important. It's going to be an industry of the future. And I said, what is it? And the woman sitting next to me said, it's called software. And I really didn't know what it was. I never imagined that that's where I would spend my career and my professional life. Well, the message, I think, for somebody who is going through college today is there is going to be an industry that will need to be one of the biggest industries on the planet in the middle of this century, the industry to remove carbon from the environment. It needs, like software was and is, to be technologically driven. There are so many innovations, so many things that are going to need to be invented to really build at scale the kinds of tech that will say, capture the carbon in the air, remove it from the air, deposit it deep in the earth so it doesn't come back. And when we put our $1 billion at work in this space, we really did it with two things in mind. One is to stimulate investment in this space in new inventions, but two, to send a market signal. And I think the market signal may be even more important. What we said is, we're not going to be in the carbon removal industry, but we want to buy the services from the industry that is created, and hence show that there's not just supply of money for innovation, but demand for its use once it's created.
Which gets to, well, first of all, sticking with this for just a second, and particularly the carbon removal, you all have, identified nature-based approaches as part of the scenarios you're looking at. Have you looked at the interrelationship on the sustainability platform between nature-based solutions, perhaps for carbon sequestration, and water quality, which you just talked about this week?
It is something that we've looked at. I mean, the first thing I would say is if you want to remove carbon from the environment in the year 2020, you really are focused mostly on nature-based solutions. I would hope that by the year 2030, we might have more technology-based solutions that will be more affordable. But for today, it's the year 2020, and there is a very close connection for the reason that you're alluding to. Namely, oftentimes today, one of the keys to nature-based solutions is the planting of more trees. Now, I think it's very important that when companies commit to this type of thing, that they frankly commit not just to pay people to keep the trees that are there now, because that's just paying people literally to do nothing. It's a good thing, but it's not going to plant more trees. We need to, as we are, commit to plant more trees, plant trees that would not otherwise be planted, and actually have a strategy that looks beyond the lifespan of a tree. Because when a tree dies or is cut down, you basically lose the benefit of the carbon sequestration in which you invested. But the connection to water quality is also clear. In so many places, deforestation has impacted water quality. So if we're going to improve water quality, we need to think about the ecosystems in which are involved, are inherent in the quality of water. It's why we've made biodiversity one of our 4 pillars. And you see this, of course, in places like the Amazon and the tropics, but you see it in more northern climates as well, where, for example, the ecosystem is suffering. There are fewer salmon in the Pacific Northwest of the United States, in part because of forestation changes. That has led to water changes. That has led to a decline in the habitat for salmon. All of this, as you know, is a constant reminder of how connected we are, all of us, on this planet.
Yeah, that sort of puts the climate change issues as a force multiplier on top of all these other impacts that we've had, which is really an important reason that you guys are looking across a more broader sustainability group of exercises and work. You mentioned cement earlier. And I just want to talk about that for 30 seconds here, or not 30 seconds, but just for a few seconds here. You've talked about using your procurement, and you just alluded to it a little bit with the fund. Talk a little bit about what you're thinking there, and the supply chain, and using procurement potentially standards that you might have on them.
Well, in a way that I could never have imagined just a year ago, I can get very excited about cement. It's not something that I was familiar with, but of course, it's part of everywhere we live. It's the foundation of our buildings. For many people's homes, it's their basements. And of course, cement is created in part because of very high temperatures that involve the emission of a lot of carbon. So what we have to think about when it comes to cement is sort of a microcosm, I think, of almost every issue. What I find when I talk to government leaders, or when I talk to other people who really understand these issues well, like Bill Gates, with whom we have the good fortune to discuss these issues and work together regularly. You almost have to start by drawing a pie chart, if you will. What are all of the different things in the economy that generate carbon, and what percentage of our carbon emissions are attributable to them? And one of the things you do find is that the cement contributes to a lot of carbon emissions. We then have to start to contemplate, well, how can we change that? And there is now emerging a vibrant discussion around green cement. But in order to get there, you have to really think about the so-called green premium. And the green premium, of course, is the extra cost associated with creating a greener form of a particular product, in this case, cement. And we'll have to then think about just the economics and the logistics of advancing the economy in that direction. Now, for a company like Microsoft, we can take certain steps on our own. We're building a huge addition to our campus, 17 new buildings east of Seattle. And so in some cases, we can afford to spend the extra money to get greener cement, or we can afford to put in other raw materials that would be, say, a substitute in some instances for steel, which is another big issue together with cement. But ultimately, I think what we're all going to have to spend more time doing is really thinking about systemic changes that will lead to real structural change in these different parts of the economy. Putting a price on carbon is obviously one way to do it. If you put a price on carbon at its source, that then goes through every part of the economy. That might be a path. But I just think it's one piece of what is really sort of the puzzle of our time, the challenge of this decade, the kinds of things we're going to have to come together to discuss and then really take more action to address.
I'm very excited. I just had a conversation with the president of a software company about cement. So But you made it clear. You use cement in your company as well as people in your supply chain. And so when I talk to people in the cement industry, they say we need more people wanting our greener cement. So here's another place where government and private sector could work together to get this done. So let's cover one more subject before we have to finish. And I really appreciate your views on all of these things. But this gets us to the larger economic development of the United States and the world. You know, we often hear, and I'm sure you hear this all the time, that there's a conflict between being green. You raised one of the issues just now, and you know, dealing with climate change and the economy. And obviously, our economy is going through some transitions already. How do you see the role of tackling some of these sustainability and climate issues in economic development, also in particular in our current world that we are in, with recovery from the current recession that's been brought on by a pandemic?
Well, I would say two things. I mean, first, I think like a lot of economics, it starts with demand and consumer demand. You know, when consumer demand shifts, people who create products suddenly start to think differently. In the 1960s, there was a huge debate in the United States. Should auto manufacturers be required to put in a seatbelt? Should they be required to put a safety bag, an airbag in the front seat? And if you look back at the history of that debate, there were people in government and Ralph Nader arguing that car makers should have to do more. And there were, frankly, people in the industry arguing that they should have to do less because they saw it as sort of a regulatory tax, overhead, if you will. And then suddenly there became a point in time in the 21st century when the last thing a car maker would want to do is sell a car that didn't have seatbelts or an airbag. It had nothing to do at that point with the regulations. It had everything to do with consumer expectations. People didn't want to buy a car that lacked these things. And this, to me, is one of the perhaps biggest hopes we have for the future. It is a younger generation that is becoming more and more important every year in terms of their purchasing power. They are people who care deeply about having a more sustainable planet. And one vision that I have is that perhaps by the year 2030, you'll be able to go into the grocery store and look at any product on the shelf. You'll be able to look at a car, and one of the things you'll see is how much carbon was emitted to create that product. And if you want, you can choose the lower carbon alternative, just the same way you may choose the lower calorie alternative today. And it doesn't mean that everybody will make that choice, but everyone will be empowered to choose. And I think when you get to that point, you'll see business and the market shift even more rapidly than it is today. And in part, it will take at the end of this process a law, it will take a regulation to say that everyone has to report this on their products. But before we get to that day, we first have to develop a reliable way to measure carbon emissions in every part of the supply chain. That's why we're innovating this year and requiring all of our suppliers to work with us on standardized reporting. And once we experiment, we incubate together with other companies, we're working with other companies that share our interest, we can then create a standard that may be adopted across an industry. The entire cement industry, for example, might measure its carbon emissions in the same way. So you go from individual experimentation and incubation to standards, to ultimately to law, to the empowerment of people. And I think that is a decade that should excite us all. And that, to me, is where a company like Microsoft and those of us in business more generally, have a lot to contribute. But it does really bring together, all of these pieces, not just in one country, but frankly on a global basis.
Well, Brad, I think we're out of time, but I think we covered the landscape that we needed to cover. But I want to once again thank you and also your entire team for the work that they do. Your ambitions rub off on other people in business, not only in the tech industry, but also in other parts of the economy. And so we're really appreciative of the work that Microsoft does. I'm especially appreciative of you taking the time to be our first conversation in EarthX CEO. So thank you so much for coming today, and enjoy New York.
Well, thank you. I'll just say in conclusion, this is an area where I think healthy competition between companies makes us each better. We each learn from each other. This is competition that in a literal way can help us save the world. So we're very excited to be a part of it. Thank you.
The scientific consensus is clear. The world has a huge carbon problem. Humans have released more than 2 trillion metric tons of greenhouse gases into the Earth's atmosphere since the start of the first industrial revolution. And the vast majority of these emissions have occurred since the mid-1950s. This is more carbon than nature can reabsorb. And every year, humanity pumps out more than 50 billion additional tons of greenhouse gases. This blanket of carbon in our atmosphere is heating the planet and changing our climate. And this isn't a problem that lasts just a few years or even a decade. Once excess carbon enters the atmosphere, it can take thousands of years to dissipate. Already, the planet's temperature has risen by 1 degree Celsius. And if we don't curb emissions and temperatures continue to climb, science tells us that the results will be catastrophic. In fact, scientists agree that if we don't do anything, temperatures could rise somewhere between 1.5 and 4.5 degrees Celsius. So what can we do? Well, it starts by understanding and getting real about carbon math. Scientists account for carbon emissions by classifying them into 3 categories or scopes. Scope 1 emissions are the direct emissions that your activities create, like the exhaust from the car you drive. Or, for a business, the trucks it drives to transport its products from one place to another, or the diesel generators it might run. Scope 2 emissions are indirect emissions that come from the production of the electricity or heat you use, like the traditional energy sources that light up your home or power the buildings owned by a business. Scope 3 emissions are the indirect emissions that come from all the other activities in which you're engaged, including the emissions associated with producing the food you eat or manufacturing the products that you buy. For a business, these emission sources can be extensive and must be accounted for across its entire supply chain, from the materials in its buildings, the business travel of its employees, to the full life cycle of its products, including the electricity that customers may consume when using something like a phone, laptop, or gaming console. Given this broad range, a company's Scope 3 emissions are often far larger than its Scope 1 and 2 emissions put together. And this accounting is important because if we're going to avoid the worst aspects of a rapidly changing climate, then the world must reduce its carbon emissions and reach net zero across all scopes. Now, net zero doesn't mean that there will no longer be any carbon emissions at all. But it does mean that the world will need to remove as much carbon as it emits. This will require 2 things. First, we'll need to reduce carbon emissions very substantially over the next few decades. And second, we'll need to remove carbon from the atmosphere, starting with nature-based removal approaches, but ultimately through including new carbon removal technologies, like direct air capture approaches that literally remove carbon from the air. And while the world will need to reach net zero, those of us who can afford to move faster and go further should do so. That's why Microsoft is committing to become carbon negative by 2030, meaning that we'll reduce our emissions by half and remove from the atmosphere more carbon than we emit, including all of our Scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions. It's why we're also committing to remove, by 2050, all of the carbon Microsoft has emitted either directly or by electrical consumption since it was founded in 1975. Simply put, the stakes are too high for us to not make bold changes now. The world is counting on all of us to act.
EarthX TV. Our planet from every side.